I think I've worked it out now. It's kind of like every time I get to speak, which is pretty consistent. Third Sunday in the month, that's kind of the calendar. And I've now worked it out that what Ash does is he finds the really contentious bit of every book, and then he plans the diary, so that's going to land on Paul. That's great. That's okay, apart from the fact that it dawned on me that we kind of changed around the summer a little bit. We kind of took a few out and added a few in, and then, oh wow, that's spot on. Paul gets the one with wives are submitting to husbands. Boom. Got it. This is a right controversial text. It is a really controversial text in our culture. And it's written in a book which is, let's face it, we pick up the Bible and it covers around about 2,500 years worth of writing, something like that. It's kind of a distant world, isn't it? And it's a distant culture. It's really back there. And here we are today, 21st century West Yorkshire, trying to work out, what do I do with this text? When we've got this claim that the Bible makes that this is the timeless Word of God, which is calling us to live. Especially when we get these really problematic areas of the Bible. So I think for some of you this might be quite contentious, what we're going to look at this afternoon. Thinking about it maybe in a different way. Certainly for me, it's thinking about it as I prepared for this, maybe in a way that I'd not really thought about in real depth, probably in all of the time that I've been in ministry. And that's the great thing about being able to speak in this context, is it really forces you to think it through. I think one of the overarching ideas of the Bible, and sometimes we fall into a little bit of a trap, is we think about the Bible in different types of writing. So we've got poetry, we've got history, we've got writings of teaching, we've got Gospels. One of the sections that we've got that is tucked away in the Old Testament, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, we've got these sections called wisdom. The wisdom books. Here's my take. The whole of the Bible is a book of wisdom. It's a book which is making a call on us today to live wisely in the light of what we see in the Bible laid out for us. So when we go to that ancient world, when we go to that different culture, I'm absolutely convinced that we can't just pluck bits. Well, we can't pluck all of that and say we're going to live like that now. It's just inconsistent that we can do that. If we take some of the Old Testament, some of the law that God gives his people, one of the laws that he gives us is that you are not to mix the cloths that you wear. You're only to wear one cloth. That is a really, really strange law. And here we are today, and I reckon pretty much every one of us are breaking that law. And many of us here would say that for decades we try to be committed followers of God and committed to his word in the way that we live, and yet we run roughshod over that law. That is just a tiny little example of how we need to think big, and we need to think in the context of wisdom when we come to the Bible. Because I think what we see here laid out in 1 Peter is some of the most radical wisdom and most appropriate for how to live today as a believer. So let's dig into it. I've got 3 headings. The first one actually I've got 4. I've got 3 looking at the text, and then I've got a kind of rounding up one. So the first thing that we see, I think, is a radical wisdom. Looking at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 through to verse 12, the 2 verses that we open with. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. The last time I looked at my passport, which was fairly recently, because I've got one of the fancy new blue ones, it says that I belong to Great Britain and, oh dear, I can't remember what it says. Definitely says Great Britain. It doesn't say that I've got a passport that says I'm a citizen of heaven. It says that I'm a citizen of Great Britain. And yet what we see here is Peter is saying to the recipients of this letter, I want you to understand that in a sense, the culture, I live within the culture of Great Britain, and he says the culture that you are to adopt and shape your life around is a culture which means that you live a culturally different life to the life where you are placed. It's different. And it's different because of this. The culture in which you are placed has within it and totally absorbed within it desires which are sinful. Abstain, therefore, from those desires. Now, all of us straight away think that this is this kind of really straightforward. There's sinful stuff and there's good stuff. I guess the culture does some good stuff as well. But actually what it is, we've got to not do that bad stuff, that sinful stuff. I think that one of the things that the Bible confronts us with is that all the things that we do, everything that we do, if it is not shaped, if it's not empowered, if it's not purposed by the glory of God and the glory of Jesus Christ as our Lord, it can become an idol. It's one of the great things that one of my Bible heroes, Tim Keller, really helped me to see. Good things can become ultimate things. And when they become those ultimate things, when they become the things that we pursue, rather than pursuing God, they shape our hearts in sinful self-centeredness. That's radical. It means that we can do some things with a Christ-centered heart, pursuing God in what we do, and it's a good thing. And the very same thing can be idolatrous rebellion against God. And they're the cultural things that we hold on to, the cultural things that we pursue. And what Peter is saying is, I want you to understand that you're to get rid of that stuff, that pursuit of those things which are not God. They're maybe good things. And there's a whole load of sinful things that just don't pursue them. But there's a whole load of good things that you can twist out of shape. And you can make them ultimate things and you can pursue them, and they become the things that you idolize more than you worship and idolize your Savior. And then he makes it really clear how to act as a result of that insight. He says this: therefore, because of that, when you start to think about that, when you start to work out how to articulate your life as a result of that, make sure that you live good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits you. Because that's the next step of radical wisdom, according to this. Exile means that we don't live outside of this world. We live within it. We live a seen life. We live a life which is portrayed, which is visible, which is not hidden away. That's radical. It's really radical that we can hold those two things together. That we can hold on to, and that's actually what comes out of the idea of doing good things that are not idolatrous, but rather they are good things that are pursuing the glory of God. They become things that are visible. That is radical wisdom for a way to live. And then he starts to say, okay, now I've said that, I probably need to help you to understand what that means. So we're going to have a look at a few ways in which that's articulated. The first idea is this second heading that I've got, is the idea of being immersed and not cultish. One of the great challenges of the idea of seeing this new hope and faith and this new pursuit is the idea that we pull out of the world that we live in. In fact, repeatedly, what we've seen is turns in the story of the Christian church where there's been breakaways that have pursued that so far that they've become cult-like. The Branch Davidians, the family. Even right now, probably on the decline, Westboro Baptist Church in the United States, where there is no sense of being in and part of and engaged with this society. We'll break away, we'll pull away, we'll hide away, we'll live our life separately. Look at what Peter says in verse 13 to 17. Here's a way that you can articulate this, he says. Here's the way that you can live good lives in the society that you are called to live in, shaped in a different way. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to the governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people. But do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect for everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. That is just what? What do you say? Peter, you are nuts, I think, on a very human level. Because what he's saying here is, serve the emperor and serve the governors that the emperor puts over you. There is a little bit of a backhanded challenge to those very emperors and governors, which is that they are there to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. That's their job. The emperors, within years of this being written, and this is why this is so incredibly powerful and radical for the hearers of this letter. The emperor, within years, is going to slaughter Christians. That's what he's going to do. He's got governors all over the empire that are killing Christians, that are persecuting Christians, that are taking children from parents and indoctrinating them at best and abusing them at worst. And yet, Peter says, the way you are to live is to submit to that authority, as though you are submitting to God. The contradiction in this is immense. Unless you understand something critically important for the church at that moment in time, the biggest threat to the church and the gospel at that moment was that it becomes a rebel movement. And there was every possibility, in the face of the kind of oppression that the church was going to face, that the amazing, wonderful gospel of Jesus would be lost in the church becoming a rebel movement. Has the church changed the world in the past 2,000 years? I would argue in lots of ways, yes. And a load of those ways have been driven for good. Not all of them, but a lot for good. But right at that moment in time, Peter says you're free. He says, effectively, you're free, therefore, you don't have to be under the control of the emperor. That's the tendency. That's what I would think. That's what I would think. Paul says, I'm a foreigner, I'm an exile, I'm no longer part of this empire, I've been given a freedom, I can see that I belong to something else, I'm now being oppressed, I'm going to get everybody around me, and we're going to sort this out. We're going to become a paramilitary organization, and we're going to do our very best to crush this empire, and what we would actually have done is crushed the gospel. And you and I would never have heard it. If we hadn't had to take that surprising step of living in that culture, which is so abusive and so unfair, that we live it in a different way, because we've got a different motive, because there is a bigger good. Paul goes on to say, 18 to 21, whole section about slaves. Slaves in reverent fear, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjustified suffering, because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffered for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. So this is to this you were called, because Jesus Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. Your freedom might give you the idea that you're no longer a slave and owned by that master. And it's really possible that you might decide that it's totally outrageous for you to be beaten unjustly and create a slave's revolt. Is the Bible condoning slavery? In this text, is the Bible condoning slavery? And we would say yes, if. Yes, it is condoning slavery if our interpretation is to take these verses and say we carry on applying those verses in that way today. And of course we don't. We absolutely say that slavery is wrong. It actually says here, is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? Do you think you can be credited for doing wrong if you get a beating when you've done wrong anyway? It's just wrong to get a beating, isn't it? Unless Peter is saying to people, I want you to think about a radical wisdom that helps you to live in an unfair, unjust world with a bigger picture than what you currently have. And that's what it is. Living in an unjust, wrong world, but seeing something bigger. And the something bigger is, it is terrible that I am a slave and I am beaten, but I remind myself that I am a free person because I belong to Jesus Christ. Immersion or cult? I think this is profound radical wisdom for living in an unjust world. The connections for us today, I think, are really, really obvious, aren't they? The beauty is we now live in a democracy. We live in a democracy. We should embrace the fact and love the fact that we live in a democracy. But our democracy is flaky and unstable and imperfect. And our purpose in this world is to live and to display a gospel which helps us to live, according to our opening verses, in such a way that we can be seen to do good things in the face of unfairness. That is mind-blowing. I think we're immersed. And yet we know that we live something radically different. The third is this. What have we been looking at there? We've been looking at the idea that there's the possibility of creating two parties of conflict. Unjust emperors and governors, and oppressed Christians who believe they're free. Unjust slave owners, and slaves who understand that they're free. Here's one of the great challenges of the Bible, I think, is that the Bible wasn't written with chapters and verses. They're really helpful because it will be impossible for me to describe which bit to read. But they were a much later addition. One of the problems with this little section is that we've got chapter 3 part way through. And chapter 3 separates, we're going to come back to the bit that I've missed out. Chapter 3 separates slaves and oppressed people under Roman emperors. It separates wives and husbands. And it almost makes us think that it's a separate section. But I'm calling this next section, we're called to be the world's relationship counselors. That's what the church is called to be. Look at verse 1 of chapter 3. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your husbands. In the same way. In what same way? In what same way? In the same way as living in a world which is unjust, is my conviction. How can we say that? How can we say that it's linked to that? Well, it's linked to that because Peter actually writes it talking about slaves, talking about people under emperors. He now talks about wives, and he says, in the same way, connecting it to what we've just been reading. Because actually, chapter 2, verse 11, through to chapter 3, verse 7 is one section. And he's taking us all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16, where it says this: this is how the world, according to a fallen, broken world, is going to be. It's going to, as God speaks to Eve, he says, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. That is not a good thing. It's in the context of what it means to live in a broken, fallen world. There will be a stress in your marital relationship. You'll desire him. The word desire is not a good kind of desire. It's kind of got an element of control. And rule is not a good word for relationship behavior. It's got a flavor of oppression. God says that's how it's going to be. We live in a world where we see that poured out everywhere. And we actually see that the church, to some sense, I would argue, has contributed to that. Because it's put chapter 3, and disconnected this from the previous bit. And it says, wives, submit to your husbands, as though that's a good thing. Well, it kind of is, but it's in the context of brokenness. It's saying he's going to behave like an idiot. He's going to be, at best. At worst, he's going to be something even worse. And in Roman times, as today, the way to deal with that is to militate against that relationship and to control and to use the controlling mechanisms in exactly the same way as we see today. What does he say? There is a danger that your beauty becomes the first thing that you bring. Because you know that he's got a ridiculous, pathetic, roving eye. And he doesn't really treat you with respect and love. And therefore use those things that will control him. And then he says, but there's another way to live, which is that you take what is powerful, which is a beautiful heart, and you make that first. And you display in unreasonableness, in exactly the same way as slaves are called to endure beatings in an unjust world. You live grace-filled lives in injustice. That is radical. And then it becomes as radical for men. Because it goes on to say, husbands, in the same way, do what? Be considerate as you live with your wives. Treat them with respect and as heirs. That didn't exist in the Roman world. These are relationship incendiary bombs for how to go about living. Wives were chattels, belongings. And Peter says, treat your wives like joint heirs. That's just mind-blowing for the hearers of the day. What does it look like when these weird Christians, this weird Christian bloke, in first century Rome goes into the winery with his mates to have a drink and talks about his wife with respect and as an heir, as an equal. What does that sound like? It sounds weird. And let's be honest, it sounds as weird as it does today. When some bloke has got the spine to call out misogyny. And he gets ridiculed by all of the blokes that he's with, because actually our culture has exactly the same problems as we had in the first century. Because our culture has got exactly the same problems as we've had from the beginning of time. And actually, the church, according to this, is called to be radically different. Radically different. With a different wisdom. With a way to live which is mind-blowing compared to the way we normally live in the world and the culture that we're called to. But, and here's the thing, we go back to where we first started, and we see this: live lives that are openly displaying that kind of difference, that even though you might be accused of doing wrong because you're letting down the idea of manpower, and you're not one of the boys, deep down there is that knowledge that that is good. And when the day comes when God's justice is displayed again, the goodness that empowers it is seen. What is the goodness that empowers it? How can we empower that kind of redemptive wisdom? Verse 22 to 25. Right in the middle of this. And I think this is why they ended up putting a chapter 3 in the wrong place, because Peter actually writes about living in the empire, living as slaves, and then he takes this diversion, in a sense, to remind ourselves that that is exactly what Jesus did. He committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. And yet, at the same time, he endured all of this kind of stuff. When they hurled insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you've been healed. That's the power. The power isn't some sort of stoical, let's go and do it. The power is in the fact that it's already been done. Was Jesus a foreigner and exile in this world? Yes. He was a foreigner and exile in this world. He was a foreigner and exile from the glorious beauty of his heavenly home. And he entered into the cesspool of this world to redeem people, to live a life which did not oppose when he was opposed, but rather gave himself to be unjustly treated. Why? Because he was willing just to be a doormat, a kind of an example of the perfect heavenly doormat? No, because he knew that there was something better. Because he saw the glory that was beyond the cross. And then Peter just reminds us, we're all like sheep. It's just a brilliant description. you ever seen sheep? One goes in one direction and they all go. It's a bit like blokes around a beer having an improper conversation. One goes in one direction, they all go down there. We've turned off the way that we should go, and we're off in a direction that we know we shouldn't go. And I believe, but I don't know, but I'm pretty convinced that it's probably no different when you get a gang of women together. Head off in a direction that's not really the way it should go. Because that's what we're like. And yet we're called here to return to the shepherd and the overseer of your souls. That's radical wisdom. That's mind-blowing wisdom to live in this world today. And I pray that by God's grace, we might know what we see in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 24, which is this. That we see God in Jesus Christ. Who is this? Listen to this little phrase. Christ, who is the power of God and the wisdom of God. Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Because after all, the whole of the Bible is about God's wisdom.